Hi everybody, and welcome to our module on the pharyngeal arches. The pharyngeal apparatus is an embryonic structure that is very important for normal development of the head and neck. If you look at this picture of an embryo on the screen here, it's very easy to identify these bumps that are evident below the future eye. Those bumps are the pharyngeal apparatus, and they are going to grow into a number of important structures in the head and neck. Let me pause and briefly mention some terminology. The word branchia is the Greek word for gills, so a branchial structure is an embryonic structure that develops into the gills in fish. Now, humans have similar embryonic structures to those that develop into the gills in fish, so you will sometimes see textbooks refer to the pharyngeal apparatus as the branchial apparatus. It means the same thing. We usually call it pharyngeal in humans because humans do not develop gills, but the embryonic structures are so similar that many textbooks will call them branchial. So the pharyngeal apparatus is the name given to each of these bumps and grooves that you can see in this embryo on the screen here, but you can break down the pharyngeal apparatus into three components, and each component will develop into a different structure. So the three components are the pharyngeal arches, pharyngeal clefts, and pharyngeal pouches. Shown on the screen is an embryo at about 4 weeks old, and if you were to slice off the bottom of the embryo here and look down on it, you would see something like what is shown on the right side of the screen. You would see these pairs of bumps like what I'm circling with my pen. Those are the pharyngeal arches, and there's one on the left and one on the right. Outside of the arches, these grooves between each of the two bumps is called a pharyngeal cleft. And then running down the middle, you have these depressions in the floor of the embryo, and those are called the pharyngeal pouches. Here's another picture just to make this more clear. The entire embryo looks like this picture at the bottom left of the screen. It's been cut down the middle as the black line shows, and then if you look down at the embryo, you see what's at the top left of the screen. Each of these bumps is a pharyngeal arch. The little indentation between two bumps is a pharyngeal cleft, and then the indentation running down the middle of the embryo is a pharyngeal pouch. Also shown in this drawing, if you look at the right side of the screen, is the fact that the inside of the embryo, which contains the pharyngeal pouches, is made up of endoderm, and the outside of the embryo, which contains the pharyngeal clefts, is made up of ectoderm. In another video, I'll talk about the pharyngeal clefts and pouches, but in this video, I'm going to focus on the pharyngeal arches. So each of the pharyngeal arches contains a core of mesenchyme, which is connective tissue mostly derived from mesoderm, and this will give rise to cartilage, bone, and muscles. In addition, neural crest cells migrate to the center of each pharyngeal arch, and they will give rise to cranial nerves. And then finally, an artery forms from each pharyngeal arch, and this will form what is sometimes called the aortic arches, which will develop into blood vessels. So for each of the 6 pharyngeal arches that we're going to go through, what you need to know is which cartilage, bones, and muscles come from that pharyngeal arch, which cranial nerve comes from that arch, and then finally which artery comes from that arch. So we're going to go through each of the 6 human pharyngeal arches and talk about what each one develops into. This is what you need to know for the Step 1 exam. We'll start with the first pharyngeal arch, and we'll begin by discussing the bones that come from this structure. The first arch is located very close to the eyes. The last arch is located very close to the heart. So the pharyngeal arches go from just below the eyes down into the chest above the heart. So the first one, being very close to the eyes, naturally develops into bones of the face and jaw. The first arch has 2 processes. One's called the maxillary process. This develops into the maxilla and the zygomatic bone. If you look at this picture on the right side of the screen, the maxilla is here in the middle. The zygomatic bone is on the side of the eyes. The mandibular process, which is the other process of the arch, develops into the mandible, as shown here in this picture at the bottom. It also develops into an embryonic structure called Meckel's cartilage, which does not persist in the adult, but eventually develops into the incus and malleus, which are small bones of the ear. And that's easy to understand since this arch forms the mandible. Naturally, it could form small bones of the ear, which is located very close to the mandible. The muscles of the first arch are muscles that are located near the jaw. That should make sense to you since this arch forms the mandible. So these include the muscles of mastication, the temporalis, the masseter, and the pterygoids, also the anterior digastric, the mylohyoid. This arch also forms the tensor tympani muscle in the ear, and it also forms the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. And these are some of the muscles that derive from the first arch. So the temporalis is on the side of the skull, the pterygoids are located on the side of the jaw, the masseter is also located on the side of the jaw, and then the mylohyoid connects from the mandible to the hyoid bone, and the digastric is located just below the jaw. As I said before, each pharyngeal arch is associated with a cranial nerve, and the cranial nerve associated with the first arch is the trigeminal nerve. Specifically, the first arch gives rise to the mandibular and maxillary divisions of the trigeminal nerve, and that's easy to remember if you know that this arch also gives rise to the mandible and the maxilla. Some of the dermis of the face derives from the first pharyngeal arch, and therefore this arch has a nerve that is sensory to the face. In addition, as you may know, the trigeminal nerve supplies motor innervation to the muscles of mastication, and that also should make sense to you since we just talked about how the muscles of mastication derive from the first pharyngeal arch. And then finally, each pharyngeal arch has a vascular component, sometimes called an aortic arch, that gives rise to a blood vessel. And the blood vessel that derives from the first pharyngeal arch is a portion of the maxillary artery. Moving on, let's talk about the second pharyngeal arch, and once again we'll begin with the bones that come from this structure. So the second pharyngeal arch contains what's known as Reichardt's cartilage. This is cartilage that develops into three small bones in the head and neck. First of all, it develops into the stapes, which is the third small bone of the ear. It also develops into the styloid process of the temporal bone. That's this little red point here in this drawing that sticks off the temporal bone. And then finally, it develops into the lesser horn of the hyoid bone. Your hyoid bone is found in your neck, as shown in this picture here. It contains a body, a lesser horn, which comes from the second pharyngeal arch, and also a greater horn. So the second pharyngeal arch gives rise to the lesser horn and also a little bit of the upper portion of the body. The rest of the hyoid bone comes from the third pharyngeal arch, which we'll talk about in a minute. Muscles that derive from the second arch include the stapedius muscle, which is a very tiny muscle of the inner ear. It's actually the smallest muscle in the human body. Also the auricular muscles, which are muscles of the outer ear. This arch also gives rise to the stylohyoid muscle and the posterior belly of the digastric muscle. We talked about how the first arch gives rise to the anterior digastric, the second arch gives rise to the posterior digastric, and then finally this arch gives rise to all of the muscles of facial expression. And if you know that the muscles of facial expression come from the second arch, then it's easy to remember that the nerve associated with the second pharyngeal arch is the facial nerve, which innervates the muscles of facial expression. The blood vessels that come from the second arch are not very important in the adult. The first one is the stapedial artery. It's an embryonic vessel that usually involutes in development. The second vessel is the hyoid artery, which is also an embryonic vessel. It develops into a small branch of the internal carotid in the adult. Moving on to the third arch, this arch gives rise to the rest of the hyoid bone, the part that was not formed by the second arch. So this includes the body of the hyoid bone and also the greater horn. The muscle of the third pharyngeal arch is called the stylopharyngeus. It connects to that styloid process we talked about earlier. It goes from there down into the pharynx, hence it is called the stylopharyngeus muscle. The cranial nerve associated with the third arch is the glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve 9. You may know that this cranial nerve has a number of sensory functions, but one of its motor functions is to innervate the stylopharyngeus muscle, and that should make sense to you if you know that that muscle comes from the third pharyngeal arch, just like this nerve. The first and second pharyngeal arches don't really develop into very important vascular structures in the adult, but the third, fourth, and sixth arches develop into major blood vessels in the adult. The third arch develops into the common carotid arteries, shown here on this drawing. In addition, this arch forms the proximal portion of the internal carotid arteries on both sides of the body. The final two arches are the fourth and sixth arches. The fifth arch does not persist in humans, and the fourth and sixth arches are often considered together because they share a lot of similarities. First of all, the cranial nerve associated with both arches is the vagus nerve. For the fourth pharyngeal arch, it's the superior laryngeal branch of the vagus nerve, and for the sixth pharyngeal arch, it's the recurrent laryngeal branch of the vagus nerve. And shown here in this drawing on the screen is the vagus nerve, and the recurrent laryngeal branch runs up and around the aorta on the left side. The superior laryngeal branch stays up just below the jaw. Both of these arches develop into cartilage of the larynx. So there are a number of cartilaginous structures in the larynx. One of the easiest ones to identify is the thyroid cartilage. That's this big piece of cartilage shown right here. There's also the cricoid cartilage, which is shown here in this drawing. And then there are a number of smaller cartilage structures, which aren't shown in the drawing on the right, but I've shown them on the left. There's the cuneiform cartilage, which is this small curved bone. There's the arytenoid cartilage, which is this triangular shaped bone. And finally, there are these little tiny pieces of cartilage called the corniculate cartilages. And if you know that the larynx cartilage comes from the fourth and sixth arches, it's easy to remember that the laryngeal muscles also come from these two pharyngeal arches. The fourth arch gives rise to the cricothyroid muscle, the levator palatini muscle, and the pharyngeal constrictor muscles. The sixth arch gives rise to the intrinsic muscles of the larynx, with the exception of the cricothyroid that comes from the fourth arch. And finally, the fourth and sixth arches develop into major blood vessels in the adult. The fourth arch on the left side of the body gives rise to the aortic arch. On the right side, it gives rise to the proximal portion of the right subclavian artery. The sixth arch is sometimes called the pulmonary arch because on the left side, it gives rise to the proximal pulmonary artery and the ductus arteriosus, and on the right side, it gives rise to the right proximal pulmonary artery. And here's a picture of the heart and great vessels just to make this more clear. The aorta and the left subclavian artery all derive from the fourth arch on the left side. The left pulmonary artery derives from the sixth arch on the left side, and because that's where the ductus arteriosus inserts, that is also the arch that gives rise to the ductus arteriosus. This is a summary slide with the key facts that you want to remember about the pharyngeal arches. Oftentimes, just knowing these facts is enough to answer questions correctly. So first of all, you can just think of four pharyngeal arches, the first, second, third, and then you can consider the fourth and sixth together. The cranial nerves associated with the four arches are 5, 7, 9, and 10. If you can just remember that, that's usually enough to get the question correct. And the key structures associated with the first arch are structures around the maxilla and the mandible. The second and third arches are associated with the hyoid bone, and finally the fourth through six are associated with the larynx. And here's a drawing of the aortic arches and what they develop into. You can find drawings like this in many textbooks. The first and second arches really don't contribute anything significant in the adult. The third arch gives rise to the internal carotid and the common carotid, and then the fourth arch is the one that gives rise to the aortic arch on the left, and the sixth arch, remember that's the pulmonary arch, is what gives rise to the ductus arteriosus and the pulmonary artery. If you have a congenital abnormality with one of the pharyngeal arches, it will lead to a child being born with abnormal features in the head and neck. Intelligence will not be affected because the pharyngeal arches do not contribute to the brain, but the muscles, bones, and innervation to the head and neck will be abnormal. And the classic example of this is Treacher-Collins syndrome, which is a very rare first arch syndrome. In this syndrome, there is failure of neural crest cell migration into the first pharyngeal arch. This is a picture of a child with Treacher-Collins syndrome shown on the screen here, and you can see that this child has underdeveloped facial bones. These children often have a very small mandible. Remember, the mandible comes from the first arch. This is called mandibular hypoplasia. They often have a small jaw. This is called micrognathia. They can have absent or small ears, and they can also have glossoptosis, which is retraction of the tongue. Normally, this is just a disfiguring condition, but it can be life-threatening if it leads to difficulty breathing. Because the lower jaw is underdeveloped, there can be obstruction of the airway by the tongue. So the way this would present in a board question would be a baby with abnormal facial features who is struggling to breathe. This may be a child with Treacher-Collins syndrome caused by a problem with the first pharyngeal arch. I'll finish with this slide on the tongue. As you may know, the tongue has very peculiar innervation, and that's because it derives from multiple different pharyngeal arches. The anterior two-thirds of the tongue derives from the first and second pharyngeal arches. If you look at this drawing of the embryo at the bottom right side of the screen, there are two structures called lateral tongue swellings. They're also called lingual swellings, and between them is a structure called the tuberculum impar, and these structures develop into the anterior two-thirds of the tongue. These structures are very close to the first pharyngeal arch, and therefore the first pharyngeal arch gives rise to the muscle of the anterior two-thirds of the tongue, as I told you before. In addition, sensation to the anterior two-thirds of the tongue comes from cranial nerve 5 associated with the first arch. The second arch contributes taste sensation to the anterior two-thirds of the tongue via cranial nerve 7, which is the cranial nerve associated with the second arch. The posterior third of the tongue is totally different. It derives from the third and fourth arches. Therefore, sensory innervation to the back of the tongue comes from the glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve 9, associated with the third arch, and there is some posterior taste via cranial nerve 10 associated with the fourth arch. And then to make this even more confusing to medical students, the motor innervation to the tongue is totally different. The motor innervation comes from the hypoglossal nerve, cranial nerve 12, with one exception: the palatal-glossus muscle is innervated by cranial nerve 10. And that concludes our video on the pharyngeal arches.